I am very pleased and honoured to participate in this online event on law, its application and implementation in the era of global challenges and changing reality. My name is Madeleine Garlick. I'm Chief of the Protection Policy and Legal Advice Section in the Division of International Protection of UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. One of my division's key areas of responsibility relates to the development of legal guidance on the interpretation and application of international refugee law. UNHCR develops such guidance on the basis of its mandate conferred by the UN General Assembly. UNHCR's mandate includes a duty to supervise the application of international conventions for the protection of refugees, including at a global level, the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and its 1967 protocol, as well as at regional level, the 1969 OAU Convention governing the specific aspects of refugee problems in Africa. This protection mandate applies in all situations throughout the world, including, but not limited to, climate change and disasters. I'll now move to share my screen to provide some slides which will form a backdrop to my remarks. So climate change and disasters are affecting the lives of millions of people around the globe. The most recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been referred to by the UN Secretary General as a code red for humanity, impelling us all to urgent and more resolute action. The adverse effects of climate change and disasters are increasingly contributing to human movements in the form of planned relocation of individuals or communities, migration, leading to the voluntary movement of people, or are leading to displacement, forcing people to leave their homes or even seek protection in other countries. Climate change and disasters act as threat multipliers, adding to already prevailing stressors in a society or pre-existing vulnerabilities of people, exposing them in some cases to serious harm or human rights violations, or indeed to existential threats, for example, in the form of disappearance of small island states. While the relationships between climate change and human mobility is complex, it is clear that climate change intensifies existing vulnerabilities of many people. Some of them may, as a result, be compelled to leave their homes, most frequently within their own countries, but sometimes even across borders, as they are forced to flee dangerous situations or conditions where it is no longer possible for them to live in safety. Displacement in this context is always multi-causal. Extreme weather events, environmental degradation, and social, economic, and political factors often interact and exacerbate each other, sometimes leading individuals or societies to reach a tipping point. Heightened vulnerabilities intersect with other risk factors, including natural hazards, conflict, socioeconomic conditions, and multiple forms of discrimination. Paragraph 8 of the Global Compact on Refugees, affirmed by the UN General Assembly in 2018, recognizes that whilst not in themselves causes of refugee movements, climate and environmental degradation and natural disasters increasingly interact with the drivers of refugee movements. This reflects the way in which climate change and disaster can impact on refugees and trigger or exacerbate the causes of their flight. Given its protection mandate, UNHCR works to ensure that people affected and displaced by climate change and related disasters are properly protected, particularly when they flee to other countries in search of safety, and that existing legal instruments are correctly interpreted and consistently applied. Acknowledging the impacts of climate change and disasters on human rights and the displacement and protection needs they trigger, UNHCR has developed a comprehensive strategic framework on climate action. This includes 3 pillars. One, on legal and policy issues, including normative aspects for the protection of people when displacement occurs in the context of climate change and disasters. One, on operations, focusing on disaster preparedness and early warning, seeking also to ensure that UNHCR supports protection and rehabilitation of the environment and displacement situation, enhancing resilience of people displaced and strengthening preparedness and responses. And a third pillar on reducing UNHCR's environmental footprint and greening UNHCR's operations. I'll turn now to speak in particular about this first pillar on law and policy. The focus of this policy is threefold, including action on interpretation and guidance on the application of refugee and human rights law and policy frameworks to protect displaced and stateless persons. Secondly, engaging in policy dialogue, trying to help ensure that vulnerable people and protection are central and reflected in discussions between states and amongst international organizations to recognize the scale of the risks and to focus on action. And thirdly, research and analysis in order to work together with partners to deepen knowledge on protection for people and inform policy and decision making. Under this workstream, UNHCR provides guidance to states and other partners on the application of existing refugee law instruments for protection of people displaced across borders in the context of climate change and disaster. In October 2020, UNHCR published legal considerations regarding claims for international protection made in the context of the adverse effects of climate change and disasters. This paper builds on past UNHCR work that has been conducted in the frame of the Platform on Disaster Displacement in implementation of the Nansen Initiative agenda for the protection of cross-border displaced persons in the context of disasters and climate change. And it builds on UNHCR's 2017 legal considerations on refugee protection for people fleeing conflict and famine. It also draws on a 2018 UNHCR study entitled In Harm's Way that looked at state practices in Africa and the Americas in providing international protection for people displaced across borders in situations where conflict or violence and climate change or disasters interact. This paper has been developed in close cooperation with academics, legal practitioners, judges, and other partners as part of UNHCR's role in providing guidance on international refugee or law instruments and their application. UNHCR's analysis in the paper highlights that addressing the diversity of climate change related issues and their impact on people's lives is a collective responsibility requiring action by all concerned through a holistic approach, recognizing that in the first place, mitigation and adaptation to climate change and related risks are of utmost importance to prevent displacement from occurring in the first place. Recalling that there is no such category as climate change in international law, and without seeking to expand the scope of the refugee definition in international law, the paper nevertheless notes that there are circumstances where international refugee law and human rights law may apply. Based on a legally sound interpretation of the criteria in the refugee definition, as well as regional instruments, people displaced across borders in the context of climate change and disaster may have a well-founded fear of persecution or be compelled to seek refuge abroad. This can occur in particular where climate change acts as a threat multiplier in situations where human rights are at risk, where the state is unwilling or unable to provide protection. The refugee definition in the 1951 Convention applies to people who have a well-founded fear of persecution based on reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion. Such people will require international protection where their countries of origin are unwilling or unable to protect them from such persecution and where they have been forced to leave that country as a result. When assessing protection needs in the context of climate change and disasters, those effects cannot and should not be looked in isolation. The effects of such natural hazards, including drought, flooding, and cyclones, frequently add to already prevailing problems in a country, society, or community, such as poor governance, undermining public order, scarcity of natural resources, fragile ecosystems, demographic changes, socioeconomic equality, xenophobia, and political, social, or religious tensions. Such situations can often lead to human rights violations, conflict, and violence. As a result of the effects of climate change and their interaction with these other factors, combined with other vulnerabilities, people may be forced to leave their countries of origin and seek protection or asylum in another state. It is thus often not possible nor necessary to focus on the human component in such contexts. Therefore, when an asylum decision maker considers an asylum seeker from a country affected by climate change or disasters, the decision maker should not focus narrowly on the climate change event or disaster alone as an isolated natural phenomenon or hazard, but should consider how it was and continues to be handled by a state and what effects it has on society and on the well-being and enjoyment of human rights and on people and distinct populations and communities. This human dimension may bring the person within the definition of a refugee where the risk of persecution on one or more of the grounds listed in the 1951 Convention are present, and where the state is unwilling or unable to protect. Beyond situations where the 1951 Convention may be applicable, the legal considerations highlight that people may also be refugees under the broader refugee criteria outlined in the 1969 OAU Convention relating to refugee problems in Africa, as well as the 1984 Cartagena Declaration on Refugees that has been endorsed widely by states in the Americas. Those instruments contain a wider definition of a refugee, which encompasses people who are fleeing events seriously disturbing public order, which can notably include situations where climate change and disasters result in such disorder and may compel people to flee. The principle of non-refoulement and other instruments of international human rights law may also apply to people seeking international protection and emerge as particularly relevant in countries where regional refugee definitions are not applicable. If a person has been displaced by the effects of climate change, where there is a real risk of being subjected to serious harm upon return, affecting their lives or amounting to ill treatment, that person needs to be protected from return in accordance with the prohibition of refoulement. This can bring them within the scope of complementary forms of protection that are recognized in UNHCR's legal considerations. The Human Rights Committee, in its 2020 decision of Te Tioto against New Zealand, recognized that the adverse effects of climate change and disasters can pose a serious threat to the enjoyment of the right to life. For example, because of increased scarcity of habitable land, limited access to potable water, and the lack of alternatives to subsistence. Temporary protection may also play a role in situations where sudden onset disasters, such as floods or hurricanes, may affect a population, and where people may flee across a border, and there is a temporary period during which their state is unable to protect them. And states are encouraged to afford such temporary protection to those who cannot return for that temporary period of time where relevant. The risks facing people forced to flee in the context of climate change and disaster are not something that UNHCR or the UN can address alone. It requires global collective engagement. Given the nature and magnitude of the phenomenon, and while recognizing that UNHCR has a unique protection mandate, efforts are needed on the part of actors worldwide, including states, other UN agencies, NGOs, academics, and individual experts. UNHCR works with all of these sectors, seeking to advance knowledge and better understand the protection environment for people affected by the impacts of climate change, and to seek better answers to the problems. More efforts are needed to mitigate the risks in most climate vulnerable countries and regions and adapt to the effects of climate change, as well as building resilience to enable people living in those countries and regions to withstand risks and therefore avoid displacement in the first place. Beyond this, we need to work to ensure that the existing refugee and human rights instruments are effectively used to protect people when displacement occurs. This is an important part of addressing one of our world's greatest and most pressing challenges. On behalf of UNHCR, I'd like to thank again the organisers of this event for the opportunity to join you and to wish you all the very best for fruitful discussions in the days ahead. Thank you very much.